Today's daf is Eruvin Daf Pei. A week of Daf Yomi learning has been dedicated by Jean Klempner and Gudi Weil for the Refuah Shlema Umihira of Eliyahu Yonatan ben Gittel Mira. Yehiratzon that all of our learning from all over the world will help give our beloved Eli the strength to recover and return home in good health to his family and friends. Today's daf is dedicated by Judy and Gerald Shapiro in memory of the 7th yahrzeit of their dear brother David Teichman Zichrono Levracha, and by Risa Tzohar in loving memory of her grandmother Rissel Bat Dina V'Shmuel Lev Zichrono Levracha on her yahrzeit. Okay. We are going to start on the 4th line of Pei today. We have a few interesting things in today's daf. Some of it's a little technical and some of it's a little, some stories, which you'll find hopefully interesting as I found them. We're going to start with a contradiction. So we're kind of in the middle because if you remember, we had all these statements of the Saba Pumbedita, the Signe Pumbedita and what they said. And we tried to connect those at the end of yesterday's class. But if we go back, where did we start? We started with the Mishnah that talked about how exactly do you do shituf mevoot. Okay, I'll remind you of a few things. Said one of the people takes a barrel and they put it out for everyone as representative for all of the mavoi. And it said, and he basically gives them rights to it. Al yedei beno b'to agdolim, or avdov v'shipchato ivrim, or his wife, right? He uses someone, or he doesn't have to, he can do it himself, but he can also use someone else, depending on who it is. And, certain people are allowed, certain people can't. If they're ketanim, they can't. But anyway, he uses someone to basically say, this food is now belonging to everybody else. That's what it means, lizakot. It means he does a formal act. Okay, we're going to see that there's a debate about this, but according to the Mishnah, someone has to do that formal act of saying this food now belongs to everybody. It's not enough that I just put it out and I say, this is for shituf mevoot. Someone has to actually do what we call zichiyah. It's a legal thing where he has to basically say this now belongs to everybody. The second thing is that Rav Yehuda said, and that's where we started with the Sabei Pubedita, that a chavit, this is the first line in the Gemara on Ayin Tet Amud Bet, chavit shel shitufei mevoot tzarich lagbia min hakarka tefach. We said there were two explanations. Either you need to pick it up, again, to do some sort of kinyan, okay, maybe it has to do with the zichiyah in order to be mizakeh people. You have to lift it, or you have to lift it off the ground. It has to be a tefach raised, and that's what we explained to connect it with the Sabei Pubedita, to connect it with the other ones, has to be noticeably different than all your other barrels. Has to be a noticeable difference that this is for your shituf. So now comes the Gemara and questions this statement of his that it has to be lifted. Now, what does it say? Now we're going to focus on the details. Has to be lifted a tefach. That means 1 handbreadth. So now we're going to see a source that seems to say otherwise, and within that, we're going to get into some other things too. As usual, when we quote a Braita, there's some other details there. Meitive. Ketzam mishatfim b'mavoi. Mevi'im chavit shel yayin v'shel shemen v'shel tmarim v'shel gorgot v'shel shar minei perot. So again, it's another Braita that describes, like our Mishnah, how do you do shituf b'mavoi? Okay, as we know, there were many sources floating about in that time period. It makes sense that there be another source about this from someone else's Beit Midrash. Right? Rabbi Yehuda Nasi collected the ones he wanted to put into the Mishnah, but there were other ones floating around that other people knew about. So here's one that's very parallel to our Mishnah. So what do? You see there's some differences. You bring a barrel of wine or oil or dates or figs or any kind of fruit. Im mishalo tzarich lizakot. If with the barrel that he brings was his own or her own, right, then he needs to do zichiyah to everybody else. Matches what we saw in the Mishnah. V'im mishalahen, if he brought a barrel that was, let's say, jointly owned by everybody in the mavoi, tzarich lehodia, he needs to tell everybody that he's doing this. Okay, we're going to talk about this a lot today. How much does everybody need to be in the know? Okay, so here it says you need to tell everybody. Umagbia min hakarka, and this is the point that's relevant right now for the Gemara. It says in the Braita, umagbia min hakarka mashu, and he lifts it from the ground. Again, both interpretations could be relevant here, whether physically lift or, right, where he has to pick it up to do a kinyan, or he just needs to have it raised higher than all the others. But by how much? Mashu, just a little bit, not a whole handbreadth, right? It says just a little bit. So that seems to contradict Rav Yehuda. And again, Rav Yehuda's an Amora, and this is a Tanaitic source. How could he go against what it says in a Tanaitic source? So my mashu nami tekama tefach. They say, oh, when it says mashu, it means a small amount. What's an amount? Oh, an amount is a tefach, 1 handbreadth, right? What's a small measurement? A tefach. So we've seen this before where mashu could mean any little bit. Sometimes mashu actually means a certain amount. It just doesn't say how much, and it's some sort of small amount. So you could actually say it doesn't contradict. Now we're going to get back to this issue of zichya. And we're going to see an interesting machloket. Itmar, shitufei mevoot. When it comes to shituf mavoy, that's what we're talking about, joining of courtyards that all open up into the same alley. Rav amar ein sarich lizakot, u'Shmuel amar sarich lizakot. There's a machloket Rav and Shmuel. Rav says you don't need to do zichya. Now Rav is going to have a problem because our Mishnah says you have to do zichya. Right? It said it exactly in our Mishnah. What do? This is how you do it, and you're mizaka everybody else. So Shmuel makes perfect sense with our Mishnah. Rav doesn't really make sense. We're going to have to deal with that. But all the more so it becomes interesting because when it comes to eruv techumim, Rav amar tzarich lizakot, u'Shmuel amar ein tzarich lizakot. Okay, here I'll pull up the chart. It becomes very clear when you see on the chart that I prepared for today, is that you see very clearly shituf mevoot. Rav says you need to. When it comes to eruv techumim, he says, Rav says you don't need in shituf, and you do need to do zichya and eruv techumim, where Shmuel has the exact reverse. You can already see from the chart that we're going to see Rav Nachman, who says both cases you need lizakot, but we're only going to get there later. So for right now, we have a machloket Rav and Shmuel, which one needs it and which one doesn't. So let's try to talk about the logic. Okay, the Mefarshim try to come up with what's the reasoning behind these statements, and there's different opinions brought. I'll explain Rav according to Rashi and Shmuel according to Tosfot. So Rav says, when it comes to what is the issue of zichya? It's a formal way of saying that this is going to be yours. Now you only need, think about it. If I give something to somebody wholeheartedly, I don't need to do any formal zichya. Clearly I mean it. So if I mean it, I don't need zichya. That's Rav's approach. So therefore, let's think about it. If I put down eruv chatzera for myself and all of you, I'm clearly doing it wholeheartedly because I'm wholeheartedly giving over my food to you because I have my own self-interest in mind. I want an eruv in this mavoy. But if I'm putting down an eruv techumim for you, it doesn't have anything to do with me. I'm doing you a favor, right? I'm taking my food. You asked me. So I'll take my food. I'm putting my food down. If I take your food, there's obviously not an issue. I'm taking your food. I don't need to lizakototach in your own food. You own your own food. But if I take my food, let's say you ask me and I take my food and I put it down for you, if I'm not mizakeh you and I don't give you rights to the food, maybe I didn't really do it wholeheartedly because in the end, it's my food. And it doesn't do anything for me to put the eruv down except I'm doing something nice for you. But that's not enough to say. And therefore, Rav says, there you need zichya, here you don't. Again, Rav is difficult with the Mishnah. That's a separate problem. But logically, that's the logic. Tosfot gives a number of reasons as to why Shmuel says the reverse. I'll give you one of the explanations. One of them is that when it comes to shituf mavoy, what are we in effect trying to do? We're trying to say that these people living in this courtyard are gaining rights to a courtyard that doesn't belong to them at all, and it belongs to somebody else. To take rights of something that belongs to somebody else and to say, I now have rights to your property, you need something serious to do that because it's basically people giving up their property. You therefore need to do zichya. If you don't do zichya, then maybe, right, maybe people don't really want to give up their rights. Whereas when eruv techumim, what are you basically doing? You're putting down food in a random spot that doesn't belong to anybody. And you're saying, this is I'm putting it down for you. This will be your space for Shabbat. It's very easy to have a kinyan on that, right? To acquire the rights because it's hefker. Anyone can go to some random spot and say, this is mine for right now, right? You can pitch a tent wherever you want. I mean, truth is there are rules. Sometimes people will say you can't pitch a tent here, but that's because it kind of belongs to someone. Here we're talking about space that's in between cities. Nobody owns it. It's not anyone's property. And you're just putting down food there. Because of that, you don't really need to do zichya because it's not such a strong action. You don't really need a real kinyan, but when you're taking over someone else's property, you would. It's a possible answer. There's a number of possible answers, but we'll move on at this point. So that's our machloket. So the Gemara immediately says what we would have assumed the Gemara would say. And they even add something else, which is we understand why Shmuel says you need zichya and eruv chatzera in a shituf mevoot because it says so explicitly in our Mishnah. And you don't need by eruv techumim. Now you probably didn't know this, but when it comes up in an upcoming Mishnah, how you do eruv techumim, it doesn't say anything about doing zichya. So therefore, Shmuel makes perfect sense in line with the Mishnayot. Ela Rav, my taima, but what about Rav? Okay, and here we get to our first story of the day. Tanaihi, we say, it must be right? Whenever someone disagrees with the Mishnah, if we can say that there's an existing Tanaitic opinion that says otherwise, we can say, oh, well, that makes sense, right? Then it's okay. Now, what's interesting about this, first of all, the Gemara could have come up with a different explanation. Rav has unique status often, and we say Rav Tanahu Upalik. He, because he's the first Emora, and he really is the crossover generation, and he was such a great Talmid Chacham, they give him status like a Tana, and he can actually disagree with the Tanaitic opinion. But they don't say that. Instead, they say it's a machloket Tanaim. Now, what's strange about this Gemara is, what would you expect to find? You'd expect to find some machloket of Tanaim about which topic? Well, the topic in our Mishnah, shituf mevoot, right? He really disagrees with Shmuel about two things, eruv techumim and eruv and shituf mevoot. And the real problem is that our Mishnah says shituf mevoot needs zechiyah. But what's interesting about this source is they're only bringing a source that shows that there's a machloket Tanaim about eruv techumim, not about shituf mevoot, okay? Which leads to a bit of a question why the Gemara doesn't relate to shituf mevoot. Some people say they just said it was a machloket Tanaim even though they don't have a source to prove it, okay? They just assume it must have been a machloket Tanaim. So you'd have to assume that there's a bit of a difficulty, as I said, in this sugya because of that. And now let's read. And what's also interesting is you would have expected when you see Tanai here, and this is just methodology about learning Gemara, usually it starts immediately with a Tanaitic source. In this case, it starts with Da'ama Rav Yehuda Amarav, who's an Emora and not a Tana. But he's going to quote a story that happened in the time of the Tanaim. Actually, wasn't sure on my sheet, because if you're familiar with the sheets that I make, I put Tanaitic sources in a different font so that you can distinguish in the Gemara between the Tanaitic sources and the Amoraic sources, and in a different color. So I wasn't sure here because it's an Amora speaking, but he's quoting something that happened in the time of the Tanaim. So I put it in a different font because I do think that it's Tanaitic material, but it's brought over by an Amora. Usually when that's the case, it says Tane. There's again something not exactly typical in this section. But let's read the source. Maseh bekalatosha Rabbi Yoshaya. Okay, the daughter-in-law of Rabbi Yoshaya. Shalcha lebeit hamerchatz. So we get an interesting story. She goes to the Beit HaMerchatz on Friday afternoon, the bathhouse. V'chashchala, and it got dark. Okay, because it got dark, she couldn't get back in time. What happened? The Beit HaMerchatz was outside of the Tchum. So she went far before Shabbat and she didn't show up. Now, we don't exactly know why right? We don't know what happened because the people living at home don't really know because there's no communication, right? There's no emails. She can't WhatsApp them and say, listen, I'm running late. Can you help me out? I need you to put down eruv techumim for me. So she couldn't do that. So what happens? The in-laws realize that she's not going to make it home and they want it, right? They want her to get home. They like her. Okay. Not like sometimes we have difficult situations here, but what does she do? The mother-in-law goes ahead. Irvala chamota. She makes an eruv on behalf of the woman, without the woman knowing, right? Without the daughter-in-law knowing, she puts down food so that the daughter-in-law can get home in time. So let's see what happens. Was this okay? Was it not okay? Ubama selifnei Rabbi Chia. The issue comes up before Rabbi Chia, va'asal, and he says, no, she can't come home. Okay, I don't know how they're telling her exactly that she can't come home, or maybe she already came home and he said, listen, you shouldn't have done this. Unclear. But in any case, Amarla Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi, Bavlai, calls him a Bavlai, because Rabbi Chia, right, was back and forth. He says, Bavlai, forget his whole history. I should have reminded myself before class. I can't remember if he lived in Bavel and then moved to Israel. It's likely the way he calls him a Bavlai, but good to check. Bavlai, Kol kachat hamachmir be'eruvin. Why are you being so stringent when it comes to eruvin? Right? We know often in Israel they were a little derogatory about the Bavliim. We've seen some sugyot. We'll see lots more. Okay. Oh, you Bavlai, what are you being so strict about eruvin? My father said, Kol sheyesh lecha la'akel be'eruvin, hakel. Any leniency you can do, go for it, right? Be lenient. So why are you being stringent about this? So now, that's the story. Again, what does this have to do with? We want to learn about zechiyah, basically. So how does this help us about zechiyah? So, Ibayalu, they asked a question about this source. Mishel chamota irvala umishum delo zichta. What was the issue of Rabbi Chia? Why did he want to forbid? Is it because the mother-in-law took her own food and put it out, and she didn't say, I am giving my daughter-in-law rights to this food, and because she didn't do that, it didn't work? O Dilma, which would match, right? What would that match? Rav. Rav said you need lizakot in eruv techumim. O Dilma mishela yirvala umishum de shalom midata. Or maybe she took the food of the daughter-in-law. So there was no issue of zechiyah, but the daughter-in-law didn't know about it. Maybe the issue is the daughter-in-law has to know that you're putting out an eruv techumim for her. It doesn't work without her knowledge. So Amar Lahen, so the answer they got was, Hahume Rabbanan. Okay, Amar Lahen Hahume Rabbanan. There was a rabbi who answered them. Rabbi Yaakov Shmei. His name is Rabbi Yaakov. And he said, Ledidi mefarshele minei de Rabbi Yochanan. Again, there's this story that was going from the time of the Tanaim. It got down to the Amoraim. They were discussing it, trying to figure it out. He says, I was told in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that the story was in fact Mishal Chamotai Irva, that she had actually taken her own food, the mother-in-law. Mishum de lo zichtala. What do you see here? You see from here, there's a Tanaitic opinion, which is Rabbi Chia, that the issue is you need zechiyah, and that was the problem here, that she wasn't mizaker. And that supports Rav that it must be a machloket tanaim about eruv techumim. You have the Mishnah we're going to see later, which doesn't say anything that you need zechiyah, versus this one that seems to indicate you do. And again, as I said, that only resolves the eruv techumim, it doesn't resolve the shituf mevoot. Amar le Rabbi Zera le Rabbi Yaakov Barad de Bat Yaakov, the son of Bat Yaakov. Okay, they call her Bat Yaakov. Okay, whatever, they go in the name of the daughter and the mother, and not the father, because the father they say wasn't such a great guy. That's why he's called this. But anyway, we're going to have Rabbi Zera says to Rabbi Yaakov again the same. They're going to talk about the same story and again ask the question about it. And again, in other words, there were two discussions about this, and they both actually come to the same conclusion. Kimatit lahata, when you get to Israel, akif v'zil l'sumud itzur. Go in a roundabout way. Ubai minei Rav Yaakov bar Idi. Ask Rav Idi the following question. Based on that story, we want to know what the story is. Ba minei. One second, I just want to check something. Right. Okay. So ba minei mishal chamotai rava umishum de lo zichtala. So again, they asked the same question. Was it that she took her own food and just didn't give rights to the daughter-in-law, and that's why Rabbi Chia wanted to forbid? Or did she take the daughter-in-law's food, and the issue was that she did it without her knowledge? Amar le, so he answered them. This Rav Yaakov bar Idi said, Mishel chamota irvala mishum de lo zichtala. And that's why. So again, you see that it's a machloket tanaim. So again, we go back to this machloket Rav and Shmuel, just to review. We have a machloket. We didn't really explain why Rav goes against our Mishnah in shituf mevoot, but we do see why he goes against Shmuel when it comes to eruv techumim, because there seems to be a machloket tanaim about it. So we see they have the flipped opinion. Now we're going to see Rav Nachman. Amar Rav Nachman, naktinan echad eruvei techumim ve'echad eruvei chatzerot, chad shitufei mevoot, whether it's eruv techumim, eruv chatzerot, he adds an eruv chatzerot, which we weren't talking about, and shituf mevoot, tzarich lizakot, you need to give rights to everybody else. But by Rav Nachman asked, though, what about the following question? What about eruv tavshilin? What's eruv tavshilin? It's food that somebody has to give, put down food before when Chag falls out on Erev Shabbat. If you want to be able to cook and prepare your food for Shabbat, you have to have an Erev tavshilin. There's two interesting opinions in Beitza, we'll get to it, about is it lichvod Yom Tov, to teach you that you normally are not allowed to cook in Yom Tov for the next day, but because it's Shabbat, we allow it? Or is it lichvod Shabbat, so that you remember it's Shabbat is coming and you don't eat all your food on Yom Tov and you save some stuff for Shabbat, right? Again, in our day and age, when if that happens, we cook an absolute ton of food and we're not usually worried we're going to run out. When it's, right, we're worried beforehand, we go crazy, right? If you ever try to go to the stores, especially in Israel, when they're not used to it, and you try to go to the stores on an Erev 2-day or 3-day Chag, forget 3-day, right? That's when I started making challahs, was when Rosh Hashanah came out on 3 days, and I tried to go to a bakery once, and it was such an overwhelming mess. I said, I'm never doing this again. So anyway, the issue is, right, that we're worried that you might eat your food on Yom Tov and forget about Shabbat, so maybe that's why you're doing Erev techumim. In any case, he asks, what if I do an Erev tavshilin for somebody else? Tzarich lizakot or ain't tzarich lizakot? Do I need to give them rights to my food or not? So instead of getting an answer to this question, we get an interesting reaction to this question. Amar Rav Yosef, again, a funny thing in today's daf. What are you asking? Lo shmi'alei hadamar Rav Nachman bar Rav Ada bar Amar Shmuel, eruvei tavshilin tzarich lizakot. Don't you know that Rav Nachman bar Ada said in the name of Shmuel that you have to lizakot? In other words, why are you asking such a silly question? It's an obvious answer. It's said in the name of Shmuel that of course you need to. So Amar le Abaye. So this is what I think is even funnier. Okay, so first of all, Rav Yosef is a little bit derogatory. What? Didn't you know about this? What? Come on. Abaye says, Pshita de lo shmi'ale. Obviously, he didn't hear. If he had heard the shmi'ale, mighty ba'ale, because if he had heard Shmuel, he wouldn't be asking a question, right? Abaye is saying, why are you being so harsh on him? He obviously really didn't hear. If he had heard, he would have said. So Amar Le, no. So Rav Yossi says, this is really what I meant. Atu eruvei techumim milo amar Shmuel ein tzarich lizakot, ve'amar iu tzarich lizakot. He says, when it comes to eruv techumim, notice, Shmuel said, ein tzarich lizakot. And what did Rav Nachman say? Tzarich lizakot. He doesn't hold like Shmuel when it comes to eruv techumim. So therefore, I wanted to know, didn't you see what Shmuel said? Maybe he disagrees with Shmuel also. I didn't mean to say, what, don't you know Shmuel says this? What I was saying is, are you going to disagree also with Shmuel in this case? Or you're not holding like him and that's why you're asking? Okay, and he made this assumption about Rav Nachman that since he disagreed with him about eruv techumim, he likely disagreed with him about eruv tavshilin. So Abaye answers back, no, that's not a fair comparison. Hachi hashta. Why are you comparing that to this? Bishlama hatam, I understand when it came to eruv techumim why he held like against Shmuel, because plige Rabbi Shmuel, b'kamash malan, he held, right, there's a machlok Rav and Shmuel, and he held kechumrin demar v'chi chumrin demar, right? Notice, if you look at the chart, he doesn't really hold like either Rav or Shmuel. But if you notice what he does hold, he holds like the chumrah of Shmuel by shituf mevoot and the chumrah of Rav by eruv techumim. So what he's saying is, when he disagrees with Shmuel in eruv techumim, it's because Rav disagrees with him. But when it comes to eruv tavshilin, Abaye says he clearly didn't hear what Shmuel said, because if he had heard what Shmuel said, nobody disagrees with Shmuel about eruv tavshilin. Everybody agrees that ein tzarich lizakot, you don't need to. So therefore, since no one disagrees with him, I wouldn't think that Rav Nachman would be machmir more than Shmuel in that case, since no one disagrees with Shmuel. So therefore, it's a very interesting logic here, right? He was going, first of all, there's a whole thing. How can you go like the chumrah? Remember, we had a whole thing. You can't go like the chumrah of someone and the chumrah of someone else. So how does he hold like the chumrah of Rav and Shmuel? So you'd have to say that here, to go by both chumrot, they're not mutually exclusive. Remember, we had a whole discussion there. We said when holding by them and they would each be mutually exclusive of the other, then that would be a big problem. You can't hold by two different chumrot, two different stringencies, because what you're doing makes absolutely no sense. In this case, you could give a different logical reason for each one. One isn't dependent on the other. So you theoretically could be machmir in both cases. And therefore, he wanted to know, right, what Abaye is explaining is, maybe he really didn't know that Shmuel said anything about eruv tavshilin, but if he had seen it, he obviously would have held like him because no one disagrees. So it was just a simple lack of knowledge. Okay, now we get to another interesting story. And now we get into a whole different topic, which is, and it was kind of mentioned earlier in that Braita, can you do something against someone's wishes? Let's say someone doesn't want to join the shituf mevoot. Now, shituf mevoot is helpful for you because if it's helpful, then it's good for you, right? It allows you to carry. So we've seen zachin adam shelo b'fanav, right? You could do something for someone even when they're not there, when we know it's good for them. Sometimes shituf mevoot can actually be not so good for someone, because if let's say I have two mavois that my chatzir borders on, and one side is doing a shituf mevoot, and I wasn't part of it. Maybe it's because I want to be part of the other one. You have to be part of one or the other. You can't be part of both. So maybe I'd rather use this side than that side. So it's a little bit tricky. And there's going to be a distinction, and it's not going to be always so clear what the Gemara means between doing something that someone doesn't know about versus doing something against someone's wishes. Okay, when they make it clear that they don't want to. Now, again, when someone makes it clear they don't want to, there's also two possibilities. Someone could not want to because they're lazy or they don't want to put in any money, and someone cannot want to because they really don't want to. There's a distinction here, and it's unclear exactly throughout, and the Mefarshim disagree, but the commentaries disagree, what exactly we mean that they didn't want. Does it mean they really didn't want, and yet we're going to circumvent? And what's interesting is, how are they going to circumvent? They're going to go to the wife. Okay, this is like when you're a kid and you ask your parents and you ask one of them and they say no and you go to the other one. That's what they're going to do here with the husband and wife. It's very interesting. So we're going to have two stories, both of non-Jews. Hahu Torzina. There was a Torzina dahave b'shevavute de Rabbi Zera. He lived in the neighborhood of Rabbi Zera. Torzina, some people say it's some sort of military person. Some people say he was in charge of the clothes of the king. It's unclear exactly, but whatever it is, it's a non-Jewish person. He lived in the neighborhood of Rabbi Zera. Amarle, Ogir Lam Reshutech. So they said to him, we want to rent your space for Shabbat so we could do an eruv. Lo Ogir Lahu, but he didn't allow them to. He didn't want to. Now again, why didn't he want to? This is up for debate. Maybe he was just lazy and didn't want to deal with it, or maybe he really didn't want to. So obviously, depending on how you interpret that, is going to affect the halacha in what if he really doesn't want it. After the kamei to Rabbi Zera, so they went to Rabbi Zera and they said, "What can we do?" Amrule ma'ule megar mi debitu. He says, "Can you rent from his wife?" Okay, go around him, go to the wife and ask her. Amar lehu hachi amar Rish Lakish mishmei digavaraba, and he says to them, "This is what Rish Lakish said." Oh, sorry, I read it wrong. Amru le, they said to him, they asked him, can we go to the wife? And he says to them, Rish Lakish said in the name of a great person, Umanu, and who's the great person? Rabbi Chanina. We're going to see the same thing quoted in the second story, not in the name of Rabbi Chanina, but in the name of Shmuel. Ishto shel adam ma'arevet shelo mida'ato. Here's a great line. A wife of someone can do the eruv for the person, okay? Shelo mida'ato. Against, okay, so now, shalom midato again. How does shalom midato translate? Shalom midato literally means without his knowledge. Okay, that means the wife. Now, why is this fascinating? Well, first of all, you have to remember, everything was owned by the men in those days. The women did not have rights. Okay, we'll get into all this when we get into in Seder Nashim. What happens to the property that the woman comes into the marriage with, and the man has all sorts of rights to it, and things she makes go to him, and there's all sorts of laws. Women in those days did not own property generally. There was only unique property that they could own, and that was certain things they brought into the marriage, and other things as well, right? I see Medina saying, right, their da'atam was not so kalot after all, right? They understood, and this is very classic, right? The women understood something that the men were not getting, like, just let it go, right? Just join, who cares, right? So make the agreement with them. Probably also she wanted good relationships with the neighbors, maybe. Okay, so maybe he was too busy. That's also another thing. Maybe he just didn't want to deal with it, and she was willing to deal with it for him. So in any case, he says one is allowed to do this, okay? So again, one option is shalomi. Okay, so I see you're saying the eruv doesn't benefit her. It's true, it doesn't benefit, but her relationship with her neighbors is maybe beneficial for her. And again, it's not even an issue of beneficial or not beneficial. It's that, do we allow her to come in his place? Now, if she doesn't really have property rights, how could she rent out his property? So the assumption here is that with the non-Jewish case, we're talking about, if you remember, really, you don't even need to do this. And the rabbis instituted this just so you won't live among non-Jews. Remember, this whole thing, really their dirah is not a dirah. So it's not really even a real rental agreement. You don't really need it. You just need it by rabbinic law. So therefore, we allow the wife to do it on his behalf, since it's not really anyway super necessary. Now, again, what do you see here? It's another case of, in the early time period, they didn't want Jews living among non-Jews. In the later time period, they just kept trying to find loopholes to get out of this, because they were already living among them, and relationships were obviously good. Maybe not good enough, he wasn't willing to rent, but the wife was. So they obviously had much more connections, and they're just trying to find ways out of this problem. So they allow this. Now notice what Rabbi Chanina said isn't necessarily just for a non-Jew. It's any woman can do it on behalf of her husband, even Jewish. The cases happen to be non-Jews. We'll get to a case with a Jew also soon. Another case, very similar. There's just like one minor variation here. Instead of Rabbi Zera, it's Rabbi Yehuda bar Oshaya. Amule ogerlan rishutech lo ogerlehu. Right? So they said, rent us your space. He said no. Atu the kamed Rabbi Yehuda bar Oshaya. Amrele. They said to him, Ma'ole megar mi debitu. Can we rent from the wife? Lo hava biyad. The difference in this story is he didn't know the answer. The first one they came to didn't know what to say. Atu the kamed Rav Matna. Also, lo hava biyade. Why are they telling you this? I think it's just interesting. Sometimes not everybody knows the answers to every question. So go to one person, you don't find the answer, go to someone else. Atu the kamed Rav Yehuda. They finally get to Rav Yehuda, and maybe it's also teaching you, right? This is against what we saw before about you're not supposed to teach halacha when your rabbi's in the city. Right here, they went to the lower, right, till they get to Rav Yehuda finally, who was the bigger Talmid Chacham. Amar lehu hachi amar Shmuel, and he always passes on the Torah of Shmuel. So, right, in this case, he says, Shmuel says, Ishto shel adam ma'arevet shelo mida'ato. So, in fact, you can. Now we're going to bring a contradiction to the fact that Shmuel says this. Meitive. But wait, it says in the following Tanaitic source. Nashim she'ervu v'ishtatfu shelo midat balehen ein eruvan eruv ve'ein shitufan shituf. If you do it, shelo midat balehem, again, this word shelo midat, against the wishes, or he just didn't know. If women do this, it doesn't work. So now we're really stuck. We just said it does work. Lo kasha, ha da'asal, ha de lo asal. Okay, there's two different interpretations I want to bring for this. It's a bit of a difficult line. One is, the classic is to say, ha da'asal, if there's no choice, then we allow it. Meaning, if he forbids, this person in the mevoot forbids everyone else from carrying because he didn't join, then we allow the woman to do it on his behalf because it has big ramifications. But ha de lo asal, now this is a little tricky. What do you mean? I thought the whole idea is they need him. So obviously he's osir. So what does it mean, de lo asal? So they try to come up with a case where the person has, remember we talked just before about a person whose courtyard leads to two different alleys. So if we have no choice, we allow the woman to circumvent the husband and do it on his behalf. But if we have a choice and we can come up with a different solution, like saying, listen, we're going to close you off of our mevoot for Shabbat and not let you come out this way. You use your other entrance and then you won't forbid us. And then we don't have to circumvent him. We circumvent him in a different way, but we don't have to have his wife do it for him. So when it says she can, it's a case like that. That's one possibility. It's a bit of a difficult possibility because most cases are da'asal. And if there is some other solution, they wouldn't need to go to the wife. Anyway, it's a question. The Rambam says he just specifically distinguishes between asar means the husband forbids it versus the husband doesn't forbid it. And then it becomes against his will is different. Against his will, you can't do it against his will, which by the way, makes sense in the Rambam's world of Muslim Spain, where everything was centered around the husband, right? It was much more closed than Christian Spain in terms of women. And there, if it's against the husband's wishes, we cannot let the wife do it. Whereas if the husband doesn't forbid, he just doesn't know about it, he's not there, or he was just lazy, didn't want to do it, that's something else. Then we can allow it. So interesting, the different interpretations here. Hachinami mistabra. And it makes sense to say this. Dim kain kasha d'shmuel d'shmuel. If we don't answer that way, forget about there's a bride to the contradiction. Shmuel himself contradicts. Tamar Shmuel, he says in a different place, Echami b'nei mavoy, sheragil lehishtatef in b'nei mavoy. If you normally join the shituf mevoot, v'lo nishtatef, and on one particular Shabbat you didn't, b'nei mavoy nechnesim letoch beitov v'notlim shitufam mimenu ba'al korcho. They're allowed to take it against his will. So what do you learn from this? It's only, notice what it says, it's only ragil. It's only if he normally does. Ragil in, she'ein ragil lo. But if he doesn't normally do it, then you can't, which sounds like since he normally does it, you can assume he would be willing, he just for some reason didn't. And then you can do it against his will. But if he clearly doesn't want to do it, then you can't. Shma mina. Lema meseale. Let's suggest that maybe this Braita supports Shmuel. This is fascinating discussion about things that one can force one to do halachically, right? We talk a lot about kfiyah datit, right? Where sometimes people force other people to keep certain religious things, right? Or let's say in Israel, there's a debate, right? Can we force everyone to get married according to halacha? But here, it's also, can we force someone? Now here it's very different than those because kfiyah datit, usually we say, why should you force someone to do things religiously when it doesn't necessarily affect you? And that's, I guess, the claim. Well, it will affect us if we allow people to marry anyone they want and not have keep to rules. Well, it's going to affect all our children and marriage and all that. But let's leave that topic aside. This is a very different issue. We're all living together and this one person is being rude or insensitive to all of our needs. Are we allowed to force that person to say, listen, we live in a community and you have to keep to what we're doing. You can't mess all of us up. So here we see a source that says, you can force someone to be part of the lechi and the korah, meaning giving money for it, right? To set up, right? Remember, there's two parts of the eruv. There's the food and there's the beam and the right, the post or the crossbeam. So there you see, maybe this would support Shmuel that you can have the wife do it. It's the same thing against his will. So they say, Shanei Hatam, okay, both these answers, there are going to be two answers. They're very difficult. Some people don't even have the version of the Gemara that even has the second answer. Some people have different wording in the second answer. The second answer is very problematic. Even the first one's a little tricky. Shanei Hatam delekam bechitzot. I'll go with Rashi and then I'll mention a big difficulty in Rashi. But in any case, I'll stick with Rashi. Rashi says, a lechi v'korah serves his needs well because it protects the mavoi. It closes off the mavoi from other people coming in, or it protects it. Now, it's very weird to say that a little post on the side or a beam going across the top really protects a mavoi. So that's the difficulty in Rashi. But somehow he says, because it has mechitzot, we can assume it's good for him and therefore allowed to do it against his will. Whereas when it comes to shituf, not necessarily. Lishna Achrina, second answer, mitzad shane. Mitzad, they say the lechi and korah are an inherent part of the mavoi because it's up there, whereas the food is like a side thing. Again, it's not the clearest answer. It's not a great answer. Some people say it's in mibetin. Some people, there's all different. I'm going to leave it at that. But some people, like I said, don't even have these words. That's why I'm not going to spend too much time on them. Okay, itma. Now we're going to have another machloket. This because we mentioned lechi and korah, and because maybe we mentioned Ashera the other day. So remember, Ashera was a tree that was used for idol worship. So Rav Chia bar Ashi Amar Osim lechi Ashera. You can make a lechi from an Ashera tree. Very interesting. Rav Shimon ben Lakish Omer Osim korah Ashera. Okay, you can make even the crossbeam can be from an Ashera. Okay, now why is this? So what's the issue with Ashera? You're supposed to burn any avodah zarah that you see. So if you're supposed to burn it, theoretically, it's viewed as if, okay, according to halacha, we're going to see it in the Gemara in a minute. It's called kitute michtat shiure. It's basically considered like something that has no requisite amount because it's supposed to be burned. So it's as if it's really not here. So they're going to say like this: Man damar korah. If you say a korah is okay, kol sheken lechi. Remember, the lechi doesn't need any minimum size. The korah needs to be a minimum of a tefach. So if you think you can use it for a korah, then you're going to say, of course, then you could use it for a lechi. But mandamar lechi of al korah lo. But if you say yes for the lechi, which doesn't have a requisite amount, and that's why. But when it comes to the beam, which needs a tefach of thickness, lo, because kitute michat shiure, because even if it physically is a tefach wide, it's for your intents and purposes, we view this as something that needs to be burned, and therefore it's viewed as if it doesn't even have any sort of shiur, and then you wouldn't be able to use it. Okay, the ones who say you can use it would have to say maybe this is for a mitzvah, and again, it's not hana'ah, it's not benefit, right? And therefore, because avodah zarah is forbidden to gain benefit from, so you have to view it in that way. Okay, new Mishnah, nitma'et ha'ochel. So you have to put food there. We learned in the previous Mishnah. What if all of a sudden the size of the food diminishes, and now you don't have enough food for what you need for your shituf mevoot? At the end of the Mishnah, they're going to start describing how much food do you need. Mosif we're back to what people need to know. In this case, you can add more food, be mizaka, everybody say, I give you rights, and you don't need to tell anybody. Okay, nobody needs to know that this happened. It's not relevant to them. They already joined the mavoi. All you need to do is add some more food. Nitvasfu alehen. But if new people join the alleyway on Shabbat, let's say, or let's say it was ready before Shabbat and they joined, mosifu mizakeh v'tzarich lodia. Then you have to add food. You have to do this zichiyah, and you need to tell them because they need to know. Because as I said, maybe they don't want to be part of the shituf. You need their input. You need their agreement. Kamahu shiuran. What's the amount of food? Well, it depends how many people you are. Bizman shehem merubim, which of course the Mishnah doesn't tell you what that is. When there are a lot of people, mazon shtei seuda lekulam. You need 2 meals, like a 2 meals worth. That covers everybody. In other words, 2 meals for one person covers you. Bizman shem muatim, but if they're less than that, which we don't know exactly how many people that is, the Gemara will try to give it a number. If they're less than that, kigro geret l'kol echad ve'echad. Then they need a dried fig, the size of a dried fig for each person in the mavoi. Amar Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi disagrees with Tanakama. Remember, the Tanakama said if the food diminishes, you have to add, be mezakeh, and you don't need to tell anyone. So he says, if it happens in the beginning, when you're making your eruv and you don't have enough, then you need to do that. But once you put the eruv and it was set at the beginning of Shabbat and then the food diminished, koshu, as long as you have a little bit left, you don't need any requisite amount to remain. This is a separate line, which has to do with something we learned before. If you did shituf and va'ot, you only need eruv chatzerot so that they don't forget about the concept of eruv, but really your shituf could cover your eruv. We saw a whole issue about that, a debate, Rabbi Meir and the rabbis. Now the Gemara says, I want to understand this case. Go back to Tanakama. the food was a certain amount. And then the food starts diminishing, so you add. Okay, and then it says you have to add and lizakot, but you don't need to tell anybody. So they said, what is the case? B'mayaskinan. There's two options. Either it was wine, let's say, we saw before different things, and then you replaced it with oil, or it was wine and you replaced it with wine. So they're going to say it doesn't make sense either which way, the Mishnah. If you're talking about it was wine and you're continuing with wine, my irian it's ma'et. When it says you don't need to let anyone know, it shouldn't even matter if nitma'et, afilu kalanami, even if all the wine disappeared, you still, right? That would be a bigger chiddush to say if there's nothing left, you can put new wine in its place and you don't need to tell anybody. Okay. And that we're going to see in a Braita in a minute, that's the halacha. If you put wine and all the wine is gone, you can just put new wine, be mizakeh, and you don't have to tell anybody. And therefore it shouldn't have said nitma'et. And ela b'shnei, if you want to say it's two different types, afilu nitma'et namilo. You'd have to tell people. If you're going to put oil instead, everybody has to know that. How do we know this? Titania. It says in the Braita, kaleh ochel mimin echad ein tzarich lodia. If it disappears, you don't need to tell anybody. If it's one same type. Mishnei minim, if it's different types, tzarich lodia, you have to tell people. Now notice the topic there is if it disappears entirely, not if it diminishes. So we'll get back to that. So I'll give you an answer for both. You could say ibayit ema, you could say mimin echad. And my nitma'et, nitmatet. It's not nitma'et that it got lessened, but it's nitmatet. It got entirely used. So then it would match one mean. Ibayit ema mishnei minim kaleshane. As I mentioned, the Braita was talking about if it's no longer, then you need to tell people. But if just nitma'et and then you add some oil, nobody needs to know. As long as some of the original wine is still there, that's fine. Nitosfu alehen. If new people come, mosifu mizakeh. So Amar of Shizbi, Amar of Chisda, Zot Omeret, we can infer from the Mishnah that they say you need to tell them, right? They need to know that Chalukin alav chaverav al Rabbi Yehuda. It must be the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Yehuda because it says Ditnan, as it says somewhere else in the Mishnah. It says Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Bamed Dvarim Amorim be'eruvei techumim, aval be'eruvei chatzerot, marvim ben ladat ben shelo ladat. Eruv techumim, you need the knowledge. Again, we're back to this issue. You need the knowledge of whoever you're doing it for. Because again, you're someone else who's doing it for them. But when it comes to eruv chatzerot, you could do it even without their knowledge. So it must be the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara says, why are you even telling us this? Pshita, obviously they disagree with him because they say you need to tell him. And Rabbi Yehuda says you don't. So Mao de Tema, they say, no, you might have thought, Hanemili b'chatzer sheben shnei mevoot. If he hadn't told us this, you might have thought that they're talking about two different cases. Remember, if it's a case where there's only one exit from his courtyard to the mavoi, maybe it's obviously in his best interest and we could do it without his knowledge. But the case where we said that you have to have his knowledge, he has to know, like our Mishnah, maybe that's talking about where there's two exits, right? And therefore he has to be in the know because maybe he doesn't want to go out your mavoi, maybe he wants to be part of the other mavoi. So you might have thought that. That's why Rosh Shizbi tells us, no, in fact, they disagree in all cases. Okay. Next, kamahu shiuro, how much? So kamahu merubin, how many people? How many people is merubin? Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, 18 bnei Adam, 18 people. 18 v'tulo. So wait, sounds like he's saying if there's 18 people, two meals worth for one person will cover all your 18 people. Sounds like maybe more though. No. Now there's muatim and there's merubin. Now you would say it should have been like 18 and more. So they're saying what? Betulo? So they say no. He really meant 18 and up. Once you get to 18, all you need is 2 meals worth. So why did he say 18? I was taught by the name of Abba. If you were to split those 2 sudot into sizes for everybody, you'd end up with a fig per person. Meaning, we're going to see in a minute, teaches you that 18 figs is 2 sudot for one person. And that's why if you were to split it up equally, everyone would get a fig. That's merubin. As soon as you get to more than 18 grot, you can stop there and that will cover everybody, no matter how many people. V'lo, and if it's less than that, then they're muatim, and let's say it's 17 people, you need 17 grogrot. V'agav orche kamashmalan, and then they teach you, by the way, the shtei sudot havian shmonasrei grogrot. Now we know the size of 2 meals is 18 figs. New Mishnah, and we'll finish here for today. But kol ma'arvinu mishtafim, this should sound familiar to you. Chutz min hamayim u'min hamelech. You can use anything other than water and salt. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Yoshua omer, kikar hu eruv. He says you need a whole loaf. Now here he's going to say something very interesting. Afilu ma'afa se'avi prusa e marvim bo, kikar ki isarvu shalem marvim bo. You could have a ma'afeh that's a se'ah, which is 144 eggs worth. Okay, that's a big amount, but if it's cut in slices, it doesn't work. And you could have a loaf the size of a coin, and that will work. It has to be whole. That's what's important. This is, I guess, about respect. I mean, obviously, better off not to use something so teeny, but the idea that something broken is not considered significant. This reminds us of Lechem Mishnah and how you need a whole loaf, and that it's not considered significant. There are situations where we're lenient, like by Sudash Lishit, we're lenient about that, where if you don't have a choice, you can use a slice. Okay, but generally we like to have a whole loaf. So that's what he says about eruv. Also, you need a whole loaf. Okay, we'll stop here for today and pick up tomorrow about this Mishnah. Have a great day, everybody.